To be, to become, to begin, where the river leans to the sea. To learn, to let go, to love. The world turns endless, turning me.
We've traded the freedom of the forager for the safety of the hut, and that safety is now eating the ecosystem. Welcome to part 6. Today, Jim and I diagnose the failure of the error correction machines, science, democracy, and finance, and explore the red buttons we need to survive the transition to Game B. Enjoy.
Start just by I love that energy. Let's start by unloading what you just started to say about the patriarchy.
Yeah. So we're referring to Walt Bismarck's recent paper, which I sent to Thomas and some others, that, from my perspective, provided a demented, satanic, if there were such a thing, which of course I don't believe there is, view of the relationships between the sexes at the current time. And my thought on all this is that we basically, since the establishment of agriculture, we basically had 10,000 years of patriarchy in one form or another, a dominator culture, typically by people who called themselves big men. And then the little men emulated the big men by basically dominating the women and the children in kind of a dominance hierarchy way of life. And fortunately, Game A, believe it or not, started to dissolve some aspects of the dominator culture, but not all. And particularly the Enlightenment view that all men, and in parens at least, women, are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And over time, that actually worked out. Slavery was abolished, amazingly enough. You go back and look at the history of slavery, and Jesus, Moses, and Buddha all approved of slavery. What the fuck, right? It took a real giant insight to realize there was something wrong with that. Around 1820, 1830, some of the sharper people started realizing, wait a minute, that has to apply to women too. John Stuart Mill's famous paper, The Subjection of Women. And it's like, whoa. It was like, he wrote that, I don't know quite when he wrote it. It was in the mid-19th century. And at first I was just considered utterly insane because of the 10,000 years of patriarchy. But guess what? Over time in the United States, I think it was one of the first in the world, the state of Wyoming gave the vote to women in like 1870. And it gradually built in like the 1920s, maybe. The U.S. gave the vote to all women. Interesting, Switzerland didn't give the vote to all women until late in the 20th century. I don't remember the exact year, but it might have been as late as the 1980s. But anyway.
And Nassau was first. The pirates were first, right?
Well, the pirates were first.
Yeah, proto-democracy in Nassau.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Anyway, this back to show that the patriarchy had been very strong, started to unravel, call it in the 1820s, 1830s. By about 1975, I think majority of good-hearted people realized that women should be equal in all functional ways to men. There should be no legal impediments to women. And yet there still was in 1975, in the United States, a married woman could not sign a mortgage by herself or get a credit card without her husband's permission. It's hard to imagine in 1975 that was still true. So the legacy of the patriarchy was tremendous, but it was starting to unravel. And unfortunately, what came out the other side has so far been strangely incoherent, and roles for both women and men have not really solidified in a way that produces a strong, coherent culture. And I would say that men in particular seem lost. They had this model of patriarchy, and now that they don't have it, it's not clear what they have, at least for the younger ones. And again, at least that's what comes through in Bismarck's essay, and instead is kind of this depraved, hyper competition, hyper cynical, hyper exploitive view of the relationship, and basically deeply antagonistic view of the relationships between the sexes. And yet we know that that's not how history was before the Dominator period, back in the epoch of more egalitarian forager peoples. Men and women have their spaces. They overlap to some degree. They're separate to some degree. And it was, the core basis of life in some sense was the relationship between the genders, and having and raising children, and acculturating the next generation, and the life ways of the community. They were a joint emergence from the two sexes operating in overlapping but somewhat different ways. And we have not found that coherence between the genders, particularly exemplified. He's probably very extreme. He's talking about the, urban avant-garde and all this sort of stuff. But those ideas often percolate down into wider society. And so I would suggest that part of what Game A needs to solve is to help bring into being probably multiple ways of the sexes to work together to create a coherent civilization.
A couple of years ago, our mutual acquaintance Alexander Bard gave me this lens into thinking about this in an entirely fresh way, at least for me, which was rooted in the understanding of the configuration of nomadic hunter-gatherer tribes. And what he brought forward was that the way they were organized as a society was that roughly 45% of the population was at the center in one big group, basically weaving the cultural fabric, and with that, obviously, the values. And that's the feminine energy group, mostly the women, surrounded by a circle of roughly 5% of androgynous people who could translate between the female feminine energy inner circle and then the outer circle of men organized in smaller groups, 45% in the masculine energy ring, so to say, in smaller groups doing everything from chilling to killing, right? Whatever was,
I like that.
whatever was needed. And then another 5% group around that, interfacing with other tribes, the crazy ones, the
shaman,
the shamans, the diplomats, right? So, and now, what that's, I find two interesting things here, and I'm really curious to see how that lands and what you make of that with regards of the Game A, Game B transition and building towards Game B. But one, Forrest's small group process maps beautifully onto that, because there's a consensus happening in one big group that then informs on a value cultural basis what the action groups, the testosterone-driven action groups, are allowed to do, right, and should do. And in the small group process, then those meritocratically organized hierarchical groups are bound by the democratic emergency button, right? I don't know how that factors into the nomadic configuration, but and then also what I learned from my wife about the really deep hormonal differences and how that maps into life perspective between men and women, right? testosterone being one amplifier that men carry, and it amplifies situational and cultural incentives, while women have four very distinct hormonal situations that they experience again and again across the cycles as long as they have the cycles, right? And they're very aware of that cyclical nature that you and I are not. And all of that together weaves for me into something that could be a very interesting fabric for coordinating groups of people.
What are the four cycles?
Well, I know the language. So it starts with the mother. I only know the kind of the more spiritual language my wife uses, but it starts with the mother. That's when she bleeds. That's when she is actually herself, right? And then she moves on to the maiden. The maiden wants to understand. She's constantly questioning. So the mother is integrative, right? Wants to bring everybody together, and she's in a quite a silent mode, right? But she's integrative. She wants to bring everybody to the table, but she's not at the forefront. The maiden is more at the forefront. She wants to understand, and she wants to ask questions. Then there's the crone. The crone is in her image she's like the winter. She's the old woman who goes down into herself, into safety, into the cabin. She doesn't she's very, very reflective. And then there's the enchantress, and she's very outward going, very explosive. She questions everything. She doesn't try to understand like the maiden, but she questions everything. That's usually what is perceived as problematic culturally in our what we call premenstrual usually. And just that as an example, you could, if you live in a healthy configuration, then you could see that as a cleansing energy in the relationship. You could see all the things she's questioning as something, okay, let's just figure out how we have to recalibrate, right? Just in a combination of two, of a couple. And now those four phases synchronized across many women who then see life differently in each of these phases, but in coherence, because as we know, women start to cohere their cycles if they spend time together, right?
Under certain circumstances, it's but it takes a pretty high level of density, like living together in a relatively high density. But it can happen. It generally does.
In the context of the nomadic tribe, for sure, right?
Okay, let's continue. I've got to have a response here to Bard and his vision.
But these four archetypes to Vanessa are so distinct that she writes messages between them.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right? So I think this is something that is really, really hard to understand from a male perspective. That's why I'm putting so much emphasis on this, because I can activate myself into doing something at any given moment if I have to. And that is true across the day, across the year, across the month, all the time. And she experiences that differently. And she only makes really life-altering decisions when she's bleeding. And that's when she's the boss, right? That's when she's her real her. That's just her decision. But and the boss writes to the others write to the boss, and then they make the decision together. So.
Makes sense. And, it also fits, where I was going with my own model, which is that men and women are different, right? And even though they should be entirely legally equal, we should not expect them to play the same roles in society. Right? For instance, the last legal prohibition in America, with respect to women, was to be Marine Corps infantry officers. It was forbidden by law until 5 or 6 years ago. And the law was repealed, and some women applied to be Marine officers, go through Marine officer training, which is famously rigorous, right? And relatively few of them made it, but a few did, right? And so that whole arc, to my mind, exemplifies how we should think about men and women. Some very radical feminists would say that if it wasn't for our social structures and social conditioning, half of Marine officers would be women. And I would say no, that the differences between men and women are sufficiently strong that I would never expect more than a percent or two, maybe 5% at the most of Marine officers to be women. But the fact that those 5% can be Marine officers is ethically and morally important. But to expect it to be 50-50 is a form of deep misunderstanding of the sexes.
Let's explore that a little bit. So in my picture, I would say the majority of the generals should be women, because they cohere more around what's the big picture, where should we be going, while the Marines are the ones executing. So what do you think of that?
I don't know about generals, but I have long advocated that declaring war, I would add a third branch to the U.S. Constitution, which is the grandmother's caucus or grandmother house. And the only people allowed to vote for these people or to be a delegate are grandmothers. Probably the same as we do for the Senate, 2 per state. So it would be 100. And their only power is to declare war or declare peace. No war may be declared without the approval of the grandmother house, as an example.
I love it.
And then that is the most mature female energy. It has the perspective of the well-being of the lineage, right? Grandmothers really care about their grandchildren. They really care about the whole arc of history. They have the perspective on what a life lived is, which chest-pounding men, not so good at. Quite the contrary, right? So I don't know about generals. I mean, I think generals probably mostly would have the masculine energy, but the people who set the policies, it might not be a bad policy to have the Secretary of Defense, the civilian side, be a woman, right? National Security Advisor be a woman. But general, I don't know. It's a different story. What is the role of a general? Most generals are fighting generals. The best ones, at least, are fighting generals. And that may well be more masculine energy. But let's, unless you want to explore this further, I'd like to go back to Bard.
No, that's fine. Go back
I think
to Bard.
Bard is entirely ass backwards here. I think this is a terrible model and is kind of parallel to Walt Bismarck's essay in some sense, which is this highly separate and antagonistic, to some degree, view of the roles of men and women. Let's frame this in Forrest Landry's small group process, which I also love, and in fact, fairly regular contact with him. I'm trying to encourage him to expand it beyond small groups. He's very resistant. I may just have to do it myself. And for the people who are listening, Forrest's small group process, very simple, combines the power of democracy, consensus, and meritocracy into a nicely integrated, very simple system. Let's take a community. Forrest still resolutely says it can't be bigger than 16 people. I think he's wrong, but what the hell? It's his system, so let's use his formulation. And any delegation of power within the group must be done by consensus. So the group first goes into consensus, and let's say we decide we need to appoint some group to run the sewage system in our little communities. We're going to take our composting toilets and we're going to take the output, put it into a pile. The stuff's going to be composted, and only when it's safe and ready will the compost be used for our agriculture. So the consensus process says, all right, I mean, we probably all shouldn't be dealing with the sewage, so let's appoint somebody to be in charge of sewage. And we say, Thomas, he's a good shit handler. He is our king of processing the sewage for our community. And he agrees, and he says that's a job of honor to produce fertilizer for our farm. So he is appointed, given the power and authority to, recruit people to help him and do all that. And he then has absolute power to execute on the sewage thing, though he can have reporting requirements as part of his delegation. It says that he has to report back monthly to the consensus community how things are going, etc. And you go, wait a minute, you just delegated Thomas absolute power. Isn't that dangerous? And yes, we know from history that the delegation of absolute power is dangerous, but it's also effective. One of the things I learned in my business career was giving people authority and responsibility was critical. The worst thing you could do is give somebody a responsibility without authority, right? And you combine the two, and the ability for people to really bring out their best is there. But, we don't want Thomas to run amok and become the shit dictator, right? And so the democratic element in the forest landry model is that at any time at all, by a 51% vote or 50 plus one, the consensus can press what I call the red button and cancel the delegation of authority, in which case the authority returns to the consensus process. And because the consensus process knows it's not very good at dealing with the shit, quite literally in this case, the expectation would be they would select a new master of shit who they think will do a better job. And so in very short, this is a very interesting method of governance in that it doesn't force the division of votes all the time, right? Problem with democracy, particularly in our modern democracy, where the parties have gotten so good at choosing where to position themselves against the median voter. It's always 48-52, 51-49. And so close, just shy of a majority of people are constantly pissed off by almost every decision. And if the decisions are made by consensus, much harder to be pissed off because everybody had their chance to block and talk it through to the point where they at least were willing to go forward, if not affirmatively positive. They were willing to not block in a consensus process. So those decisions aren't dividing in the same way constant democratic votes that come out 48-52 are. And the vote to cancel power is something different, right? Particularly because the power then returns to the consensus process. So it's not like somebody's being dominated by a 48-52 vote. Basically, power is being destroyed and then returned to the consensus process. So I really do love his small group process and hope that at some point he can generalize it to larger numbers. I think, frankly, just to foreshadow, I think you can take it up to the Dunbar number by breaking it down into subgroups of 16 who have a single delegate. And they appoint the delegate by consensus, and they retrieve the delegate by the red button, basically. So it's a two-layer small group process. With layer one's only appointment is to the second level, but the full small group process applies to the recall of that delegate if they're not doing what they should be doing. And then the next level manages the Dunbar level number. Anyway, that's the RUT extension to the
in my thinking, I arrive at something similar, but it scaffolds up in a fractal way through sortition, and can stay in small groups. I also think that it doesn't necessarily have to be 16. I think it can be a bit larger. But anyway, but let's go back to the let's go back to the Bard.
Yeah. So here's where I think he's just completely insane. Which of course he often is. He's very interesting and provocative, but he just says shit, right? He's a shit talker, which is that in a healthy society where the sexes have a unified and coherent being that is the culture to a very substantial degree, that inner ring should be a balance of the sexes, right? The sexes have different perspectives, different timelines, different discount rates. I would say in general, women have lower discount rates. They're more concerned about the future in some sense. Men are more concerned about winning the battle right now, right? And there's a tension between those two views. Both are necessary, because if you don't win the battle right now, you don't get to play the long game. And so I would suggest that much better way to think about this is if you want to model, I mean, it's not a terrible model of extended Landry small group process, but the consensus group should be represent both sexes equally, and the execution group should also be completely open by sex. Now, it may be that it might be biased towards male energy, but there are plenty of things to be executed on which female energy is hugely important. For instance, let's say who's going to be running the equivalent of kindergarten, right? Who's going to do the early childhood education? I'm going to put the flag down and say, because of the biological differences between men and women, while you will have 5% male kindergarten teachers, 95% of them are going to be women. And so when you delegate consensus authority, you'll be looking for feminine energy in that particular thing. The same may well be true for elder care, may be true for gardening. I'm not sure about that one, but if I look at the really brilliant gardeners, a large number of them are women. So I think that both sides of the Bard equation are wrong. The consensus part needs equal representation of both gender energies, and the execution side it also needs to be able to use both energies as appropriate for a given task. So I guess I'd say he's entirely wrong, basically.
I'm not 100% sure he's so fixed on the sex differentiation, more on the feminine and masculine energy. So it's not necessary that all of the people in the inner circle that's dominated by feminine energy need to be women. Right? I think his image is more open than I described it earlier.
And that would be a small statistical shift. Let's say 5% of men are more centered on feminine energy. Let's say something like that. Maybe it's 10, but it's not more. I don't think it's more than 10%. So yes, you can have a slight adjustment there, but I don't think that's enough. I think that the consensus ring has to be in tension between the two energies, because both energies are essential. Human culture is the tension between those two energies, and consensus has to represent the sort of the core tension that is culture.
Okay.
And in fact, I'll go a step further. Kind of the hateful Walt Bismarck perspective is probably quite likely to evolve if you were to put the consensus process in the feminine energy, because you essentially have set the control mechanism in opposition to the masculine energy, potentially. And that's not good.
Okay, what other constraints would you add? Because you very distinctly said earlier you would institutionalize the House of Grannies in the American democracy. I can see that the metabolic energy required for that consensus group varies a lot depending on the age strata that you put into this. I think if you put in grandpas and grandmas, it'll be much easier to reach consensus than if you put in 20-year-olds.
Absolutely. Well, you want them both. You want them all. You need the age profile too, right? Particularly for real-time decision making. Who knows more about what a young mother needs than a young mother, right? Now, you also want the perspective of the aunties and then the grannies, but you also need the voice of the young mother herself, right? And so the inner consensus ring needs to have diversity across age, across gender, across different psychotypes. You need introverts and extroverts. The strength of the consensus comes from its diversity to a significant degree.
Okay, now it's getting really complex because when you look at the sexes only, it's very easy to say, okay, it needs to be 50-50, because that's roughly where we're at pro rata, male and female. But if we start factoring in all of the nuances, then the question emerges: does it have to be pro rata? Does it have to be? Is it one voice per segment? What are we talking about? How do we get to a good consensus?
I think that's dangerous. I think that's hugely dangerous to try to disentangle, or not to disentangle, but to aggregate into identity clusters. I mean, that's part of this woke bullshit that has plagued America and other countries. Each person is a high-dimensional object, right? They are. To what degree do they have feminine energy, masculine energy, extroversion, neuroticism, openness? We're a bundle of multidimensionality, and each one of us is unique. None of us probably has the same setting at all. So I would suggest that the unit is the individual, and that they work together in some form of governance dynamic that allows them to discover, as interoperating individuals, some collective action result. And again, fortunately, as a thought experiment, the Forrest Landry model makes that very easy, right? So you have the 16 individuals, each of whom is different on every single one of these dimensions, interoperating until they fall into consensus, which is really very cool. And so I would not look for pro rata anything. I would just say, these are your individuals. You got what you got. Work it out, people. And
how would they be chosen from? So if we say, okay, that there's a upper scale Dunbar group, 4,500 people, that somehow want to start using this kind of process for a game B kind of governance principle. Two
levels of delegation of 16 would do it, right? So as we talked about earlier, the Rudd extension of Forrest's model to the Dunbar number up to 256 would be that you'd organize people into caucuses of about 16. They could use the exact small group process, no modification, except that the only power of this group is to appoint the delegate to the next level. That gives you 16 by 16 or 256. If you then do that again, so that the next level's only power was to appoint to the third tier. So in reality, because of subsidiarity, you probably want that level to have some power too. But one of its duties is to appoint a delegate to the next level. At that point, you get to about 4,000, right? A little over 4,000, around just short of 4,000. So a two-level fractal workup of exactly Forrest's model would get you to a governance level suitable for 4,000 or 5,000 people.
So first, the source is the root layer, from which delegation happens upward. How is the root layer sourced? Is it by vote? Is it by sortition? Is it how would you source it?
I think that's a pragmatic answer. I've proposed various. Alphabet is one way to get randomness, right? Do it by some, or even better would be a hash on your name, right? So sortition essentially would be one way. The other would be self-assembly. I think there's some dangers to self-assembly, but there's some benefits also, which is differing perspectives get concentrated, because that way you would have. So let's look at the two possibilities. Hash on your name, you fall into one of 16 bins, and then your bin elects a delegate. The virtue of that is each bin has statistically more diversity than it would if you did clustering, and so there's different. There's more different perspectives in electing a delegate. On the other hand, it'd have a tendency towards homogeneity, perhaps, right? If you allowed people to self-organize into the groups they wanted to be in, you would have more distinct points of view, which means the 16 delegates at the next level would have more diversity. And whether the coherence of homogeneity is better than the diversity of, self-selection, I'm not sure. I think it's an empirical question, and it'd be useful to try both, see which work better. I can see arguments for either one. And oh, by the way, those are by no means the only two ways one could do it. The other way, most obvious way, and the way traditional peoples would have done it, would be by family, by lineage, right? That this group of related people are a group of 16, right? And this group of related people are a group of 16. I think that has proven problematic in history, but that's a historical mechanism by which governance has been done. So there's, or you could go with the woke bullshit, right? You could say, oh, we have a black caucus, a white caucus, a Chinese caucus, a left-handed lesbian caucus, right? And by some diktat, which I think is about the worst thing you could do. Because I think we do not want to encourage these superficial identitarian divisions amongst people. I mean, that's one of the just dangerous, bad ideas of history that we should have been past with the Enlightenment, but it seems like it wants to come back on both sides. Both the right and the left want to return to neo-tribalism of the most superficial and stupid variety.
Okay, maybe this is a good moment to quickly go through your Game A history stack along the Dominator idea.
I've had fun working with this essay on Game A history.
It was quite good already when you sent it.
Yeah, I was very pleased with it, and it was a kind of a very interesting new technique of me and the LLMs operating together in a quite different way than I would work with them in the past. And I was kind of astounded by the quality that came out. Not that it doesn't require a huge amount of work still, but considering how good it was and how close it was to what I had in mind, I was kind of blown away. So anyway, let's just hop into it. We start with the classic Game B reference to Chris Boehm and the Forager Operating System, that 95% of humanity's history, 190,000 years at least, we believe, or at least we're going to say, that most humans, were able to overcome our genetic heritage and live in an egalitarian fashion. And the genetic heritage is important. Boehm goes in great depth in the book into the nature of hierarchy in chimpanzees in particular. Now, I've done some updated research on how bonobos operate, and they're also quite hierarchical. They use a quite different, more feminine style of coalition building, but the end result is very similar. The statistic that's quite interesting in both is the percentage of offspring that come from the alpha male. In chimps, it's 50+%. In bonobos, it's 60+%. So the actual hierarchy from a genetic perspective is slightly stronger in the bonobos, though much of the coalition building is actually executed by the females, which is kind of cool. But anyway, in either case, it is a very hierarchically styled society, and that was our last common ancestor before the the Homo branch came off, which is, it was not Homo sapiens originally. It was, Homo habilis probably, and then went through a whole series of chains and ended up as Homo sapiens. So it's reasonable to assume that we have a fair bit of dominance hierarchy in both the female and the male chains nature of our being. But somehow Homo sapiens, for sure, maybe Homo erectus, maybe Homo habilis, found ways to avoid that. And in the Homo sapiens Forager Operating System with Boehm lays out, there appeared to be a very deep, widespread abhorrence of domination, that people wanted to live free and they did not want to be dominated by the big man, the stronger guy. But nonetheless, the biological reality is in any group of people, some are stronger, some are more aggressive, some are more narcissistic, etc. And so in a Dunbar level community of 150, let's assume 2% are genetically inclined to be dominators. That would be 3 people. And so you're always going to have dominators or wannabe dominators in your group. And they're going to want to tell people what to do. They want to boss people around. They want to take decisions that they know nothing about and pronounce about them. And in chimp land, the big chimp would just beat up on the slightly smaller chimp and would then probably make him his ally and beating up on the next chimp, etc. But humans, fortunately, were able to use language to start to push back. And in fact, Robin Dunbar himself suggests that the origin of language might well have been gossip. And Boehm takes the idea of gossip as the first line of defense against the big man. They go, oh, that guy Jim, he wants to be the boss. Everyone's chattering. What an asshole he is. God damn him, right? He's trying to usurp our freedom, our egalitarianness. When we make decisions, we make them in some natural egalitarian, campfire style. We don't have a big man telling us what to do. So they gossip about Jim, the bad guy. And then Jim, he's kind of oblivious. He doesn't care. He starts bossing people around. And they just ignore him. The wannabe big man says, oh, go get that water. Go get that firewood. And everyone says, fuck you. And then he gets a little more obstreperous. He grabs people and, threatens them, go get the water. And they laugh at him and say, what a clown. Jim, you're an idiot. Only a guy with a small dick would be making claims like that. And so ridicule. And many times this is going to work, right? People are not going to be able to push the big man thing against first gossip, then ignoring, and then ridicule. And then finally, though, some small percentage of big men, may well recruit an assistant or two, or maybe they're just very obstreperous and very physically strong and aggressive, continue to try to intimidate the rest of the people, in which case the next phase of the Forager Operating System is by a probably quite fraught process, the community decides this person's got to go. This is not someone we can tolerate, because we do not tolerate domination. And it's very important that the family of the dominator buy into this. And probably the family, when it's working best, comes and takes the dominator and says, all right, you got 2 choices, leave or be killed. And if they won't leave, you kill them. If they do leave and they come back, you kill them. And this Forager Operating System appears to have worked for a very long time in keeping a relatively egalitarian way of life. Now, some people would object and say, well, wait a minute, what about leadership? Isn't leadership important in human cooperation? And I would say, yes, it is. But the foragers were able to develop what I've named role-based leadership as opposed to position-based leadership. So, for instance, if we're going to go hunt rabbits, well, it turns out that there's this 15-year-old kid who has just the most amazing instinct for knowing where rabbits are and how to chase them. So, guess what? The 15-year-old kid leads the rabbit hunt, and the 35-year-old woman has this amazing talent for knowing where the tubers are going to be in the wetlands along the river, and so she leads the tuber search, right? And the old guy is the expert at hunting the big game. He can track it like nobody's business. He understands what possible routes the big game may take. Because you throw a spear into a buffalo, and it's not going to die immediately. It might be hours that you have to track it. And it could go to the left, it go to the right, go uphill, go downhill, follow the river, into the swamp. And this guy has 50 years of experience of buffalo hunting. And so he leads the buffalo hunt. And over time, different people will emerge that become clearly better at these things than the current incumbents. And then just sort of naturally, the role-based leadership evolves. And there's many, many role-based positions in the Forager operating system. And nobody says, I am the chief, I am the big man, I reserve all decisions to myself. And so that is who we are as humans for 95% of our history.
And
then
this skill-based role situations creates interdependence as well, right? Everybody just knows. Yeah, you need them all. Right?
We need them all. And in fact, there's some very interesting work on the breakdown of civilizations, like the Anasazi, the Native American peoples who lived in the Southwest in these cliff dwellings around 1000 AD. And during a time of heavy drought, their death rates rose, reproduction rates fell to the point that their forager bands were no longer big enough to hold all the roles. And when that happened, they entirely broke up, and the people just dispersed and joined other tribes. So it's exactly to your point. This develops an interdependency amongst the roles, and to the degree that you don't keep that sufficient interdependency, your ability to function breaks down. Then comes settlement, because foragers were moving around and they had very few possessions. They made some tools, they made maybe some clothes, but they didn't have much. Whatever they had to be able to carry with them as they moved day to day, week to week, and month to month through the countryside, exploiting the fruits and berries and tubers and animals and all the things that foragers needed to exploit to stay alive. But somewhere along the line, three different technologies were developed, different times in different places. Agriculture, probably first. Pasturage, raising of animals for food, and then aquaculture, typically only in a few specific rich places. We're not quite sure where that fits between the two, but let's use agriculture as the base case. It didn't happen overnight, but gradually peoples in several places in the world learned that you could tame the plants, and instead of having to be dependent on what you could find by wandering around the countryside, you could make those plants grow in good soils with good lighting and good water, etc. And they'd be quite productive. And eventually we got so good at that, maybe 10,000 years ago, that we started to develop civilizations that could depend principally on their agricultural output, grains being the classic example. And probably the earliest of these agricultural communities in the Fertile Crescent, in the areas where Iraq and Syria is today, and Lebanon to some degree, they were able to domesticate an early version of wheat and some other grains, but mostly wheat, and be able to make a civilization based upon that. Now, this was not a pure win by any means. You look at the anthropological record, people became less healthy, shorter. Life expectancies probably actually went down because the diets were less varied. The crowding probably caused disease, etc. But nonetheless, a power dynamic allowed this system to spread. When push comes to shove, bet on the big battalions in the military sense, right? And so a agricultural society that could produce a higher density of people per square kilometer is going to be able, by brute force, even if the people are weaker, to push out a much thinner forager society, which, because of its ability to extract energy from the environment, is going to be a small fraction of the density. So these agricultural communities, even if they weren't necessarily a great trade for each individual, they were successful at group competition against foragers and were able to establish themselves. Then, I shouldn't say that, but probably coevolutionarily with the development of agriculture, the forager egalitarian operating system got broken. As soon as you have surplus, because one of the reasons it was really attractive about agriculture is if you had 2 or 3 good years, you could build up a surplus of grain to get you through a bad year, right? Foragers never had that. If they had a horrible drought, they just died. There's nothing they could do. They had no reserve. But if once you have reserves, your lineage becomes more resilient. But it also means that there are people available who don't have to be engaged in primary production all the time. And so a wannabe big man could now hire some henchmen, right? I suspect that was the first move, right? That the 2% biologically, genetically inclined big man happened to also be a good farmer. So he had a surplus of grain. So he found 2 thuggish 17-year-olds and said, "Hey, dudes, instead of working in the fields, why don't you become my henchmen and help me tell people what to do?" And then that pattern clicked. And then, once you can start telling people what to do, you can start telling people to give you part of their crops, right? And then you could use that to hire more henchmen. And next thing you know, you have a tribal chief with a group of warriors around him, which allows him to become the position-based leader, not the role-based leader. In the tribal situation, the chief, he doesn't always use the authority. In fact, if he's wise, he doesn't. But he has, at the end of the day, the absolute authority to make all decisions. And you've now lost the egalitarian operating system. And it's an interesting question. Could the transition to agriculture have been made without the transition to big man dominator culture? Don't know, but it is interesting that it never was, basically. There are very few, very old examples of what looked like more egalitarian agricultural systems. But once you get past the first 1,000 or 2,000 years or so, they all collapse into big men dominator systems, into warlords, proto-states, chiefdoms, states, empires. It seems pretty ubiquitous. So probably the social technology of that time made it inevitable that the combination of agriculture or the equivalents in nomadism and aquaculture led to this dominator system. This dominator system was then the operating system of the world for 10,000 years. Not everywhere, because it's always important to keep in mind that initially agriculture was just this one small area, then another, and then another. China, the Indus Valley, Egypt, in the New World, the Mayan Low Country initially, and then up in the Andes, and then central Mexico, and then that spread basically throughout the Americas. And then in the Old World, these islands of agriculture spread. They spread through Turkey, Anatolia, into Europe about 7,500 years ago, north into where Russia today, south into Southeast Asia. They never did make it to Australia, which is interesting. And then there was always strong refuges of forager people, and forager people, existed in Southeast Asia until a couple generations ago. Small isolated bands. There's still a group called the Andaman Islanders out in the ocean off the coast of India that still to this day are pure foragers. kill anybody that attempts to land on their island. They're great, yeah. And then the Amazonians were another, group that persisted, and the Australians. And so there's always been foragers, and it's been this gradual thing. But in general, it was dominators, and then the dominators fight each other. That's their nature. And it's one of the saddest things when you read world history is you read these civilizations that build, some real richness in terms of art and science and ways of living. They're quite beautiful. And then they get conquered by their neighbor, or they go to war and they lose the war, and their neighbor takes them over, and they become some drab militarized place again. The destruction of human capacity through conflict amongst dominators, just a horrible pattern for 10,000 years. There were a few exceptions, very few, but there were some. The flowering of democracy in Greece in the classical period didn't last long, 100 years, maybe 150. And then Rome, interestingly, was by far no means a pure democracy, but it had democratic elements for 700 years, which is quite amazing. It eventually succumbed to big manism at the fall of the Republic into the empire around the turn of the first millennia AD. And there are a few other examples here and there. Very few, though, essentially zero in the East, not zero. But most of the time was kings, warlords, etc., fighting each other. Then came a unique opening in human history that, if we can protect it, may be our gateway to infinity, our gateway to the future. And that was, exactly when it started. At least, maybe the earliest seeds were the Renaissance in Italy, the humanists, and then the Renaissance, and it slowly built in parts of Western Europe. But then something more powerful emerged in the 17th century. Three new ways of making sense of the world. Because keep in mind, the dominator system is position-based. I am the boss, I tell you. Or I am the religious authority. I tell you the nature of reality. I give you your metaphysics. I give you what's right and wrong. So it's an authority-based hierarchical system with very little self-correction capability. You can't correct the king. You can't correct the priest. That's the nature of being a priest. That's the nature of being a king. There is no self-correction. And, to give the example of the king, talk about an idiot lottery, right? Especially if you use the classic primogeniture inheritance. The oldest son becomes the king, whether he's a stupid fool or not, right? What kind of system is that? And yet that's what evolved again and again and again across the world. But anyway, in the 17th century, something started to change. And the three innovations were science first, I think, starting even just a little bit before in the late 16th century, where a group of people, and in a relatively small area, mostly Western Europe, started to see that there was a new way to understand the universe, which was not to accept authority. And in fact, the Royal Society of England, I forget its Latin saying, was something like, take nothing on authority, something like that. And they realized finally, how did it take so long, that there were other ways to establish what was true and what was not. Now, the scientific method doesn't reach to all things, and those people who think it does are fooling themselves. But there's a tremendous amount of knowledge about the universe that can be gained by the scientific method. The nature of gases, the rate at which things fall. Does the Earth go around the sun, or vice versa? There's just a tremendous amount that can actually be learned if you throw out authority and instead use the scientific method. And so this was an amazingly powerful change in our ability to understand the world. Second, governance. Again, big men, top-down authority. somehow, probably in England, but some of that from the Germanic tradition of tribal elections of kings, came a bit of a taste for democracy. The Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta was really not so much democracy as about augmenting the powers of the lesser nobles, but at least it started having some collective sense making going on, and that accelerated, and perhaps kind of in coevolution with the scientific method, in the Netherlands in particular, a form of democracy, proto-democracy, started to form. And then in 1688, the English revolted against their king and invited one of the princes of the Netherlands, William of Orange, and his wife, to come and become the new king of England. They threw out the previous king and his family and brought in William and Mary. And in 1688, the Glorious Revolution established in England explicit constitutional monarchy, where Parliament is explicitly superior to the king. And that is essentially unprecedented in world history up to that point. And so what I would argue is that this democratic element became a superior form of sense-making about politics. The random idiot son of the king making all the decisions. I mean, talk about a shit-for-brains way to run a world. Even a very limited democracy, which, keep in mind, it was the franchise was to landowners pretty much only, etc. Is, I would say, time has shown a better way to make political decisions rather than what fool happened to inherit the throne in this particular generation. And then the third innovation was finance. I mean, there'd always been markets and trading and finance, but they'd always been heavily under the thumb of the kings and the churches. The churches said, you can't charge interest. The king says, I'm just going to take your money because I can, right? Or I'm going to tax it at some exorbitant rate, or I'm going to grant one of my cousins the monopoly on the sale of tobacco or something. First in the Netherlands, specifically Amsterdam, a new way of doing finance became organized with the Bank of Amsterdam that was outside the control of the government, and it could establish pretty much what it wanted to do with respect to what projects it financed and how the returns were allocated back to people. And again, due to a historic contingency, the king was kind of out of money, and he was to finance a war with France. And because of being a constitutional monarch, he couldn't just take what he wanted. Parliament wouldn't give him new taxes. And so one of the powers he did have was he could grant a charter to the Bank of England, which he did. The Bank of England financed his war, in return got very substantial freedom to operate finance outside the authority of church and state. And so free finance emerged at the very end of the 17th century. And I would argue the way science was better about finding the truth about nature, democracy is better about finding truth about governance. Free finance was way better at optimizing the economic cycle, and in particularly allocating social surplus in forms of investment, at least denominated in money. So these three things came together around 1700 in the Netherlands and England, principally. Scotland came in 1704, I think, when the Union of Scotland and England occurred. And the Scottish also had the Scottish Enlightenment, which was working on similar ideas. And so this fusion produced something really, truly new in human history after 10,000 years of the pure dominator system, which was still the dominator system. It's very important to keep that in mind. But the dominator system with collective sense-making now intimately inserted into three of the most important processes of the social operating system: understanding nature, doing governance, and allocating our social surplus in each turn of the economic cycle. So where was the world in 1700? This is also hugely important. the population of the world in 1700 was 625 million. It had been growing very, very slowly for a very long time. And no major disruptions of how the world worked had occurred ever, probably, since the invention of agriculture. Lots of incremental little improvements here and there, but nothing basically discontinuous. And further, the 625 million people lived in mostly what we would call today real poverty. They had lost the freedom of the forager, where I could move on and live on my own. I was dependent on landowners and nobles and militaries to protect me from other predators, etc. But I was lucky in a hut with a dirt floor, no windows, and I'm in a cold climate, a smoking chimney in which I suffered from respiratory diseases all winter. Half my children died before they were 5. It was life expectancy was 27 years, 28 years. This was not a rich world, to say the least. And I would say that was the result of 10,000 years of dominator culture. But this upgrade suddenly changed everything. And within a few decades, the curve was rising very, very powerfully. And I would say that this new synthesis, 1700, with these 3 additions, is game A. It's the game we're still playing to this very day. And again, it's very important to keep in mind, it was a big upgrade. It was a huge plus. But humanity was tiny, 625 million people, basically a 12th of what we have today. And the poverty meant that the amount of energy and material used per person was about a 12th of what the average human, including all the poor people in sub-Saharan Africa, etc., consume today. So you multiply the 2 together, about 150. So we were at less than 1% of the imposition on the ecosystem of what we are today. So we couldn't hurt the ecosystem, really. The ecosystem was way bigger than we were, and there was no reason that the humanity of 1625 or 1700 should have been particularly worried about the fact that we have just let loose a machine that was eventually going to eat the ecosystem, but it did. So that's the story up to the emergence. I shouldn't say invention. Nobody invented this thing, right? This was not a conspiracy. These are things that occurred, perhaps coevolutionarily, probably downhill from the invention of the printing press, right, which was a while back, but not that far back. Probably downhill from invention of Protestantism, which put a different spin on the individual versus the collective. And it's interesting that both England and the Netherlands were Protestant regimes. So, these things don't come from nowhere, but they came together in an extremely powerful way around 1700.
And they had error correction built in, right?
Yeah,
at least in
that's
theory.
Key. They had sense making and error correction. So let's say a democracy a democratic parliament chooses to do something. It can then realize that it's wrong and reverse direction. Right? Of course, a king could do that too, but it's probably better. Its power is probably better in the initial decision because it has multiple perspectives and multiple skills. And probably on average, the delegates to parliament are smarter and better educated than the king, right?
And obviously, the error correction in science is very well defined.
Hugely powerful. That's what it is, right? Science is really nothing but an error correcting machine.
And the theoretic error correction in the resource allocation segment, sense making, finance is the market. But
exactly.
the error correction of not really, right? Because if you mix transaction with accumulation, then you can easily start skewing markets, and then that leaks into the other modalities, right? So you can capture governance, you can capture science.
Yeah, let's talk about that next time.
Okay.
I think it's probably about time to wrap this one up. And so let's focus on our next one.
Let's pick it up
The
with
history
error
of game A.
correction. Yeah, history of game A, error correction, and how it went wrong.
Yes, error correction
Okay.
that wasn't sufficient for the task
Wasn't
as the
sufficient,
system got stronger.
Okay.
Yeah, it was necessary but not sufficient for the task. All right, that's good.